Hogwarts Legacy is clearly a game made by fans for fans. With an incredible attention to detail and a genuinely interesting place, the real question is Hogwarts Legacy a good enough game to be enjoyable to a non-fan of the wizarding world? With such strong source material to pull from for a video game world, there's a lot this game does right, with a few missteps along the way. Before we get too far, this review will contain some spoilers here and there, and so keep that in mind if you're wanting to go in completely blind. With an action-packed opening scene fitting of its source material, the visuals immediately stood out to me as a positive. Character models have a lot of detail from their hair to clothing. Like most open-world games, Pop-In is present here, especially when traversing outside of the castle on a mount, but overall this title is rather visually stunning. Texture quality and variety is especially high here. I can't think of a time where I encountered a character or object that felt out of place due to some awkwardly low resolution textures or any egregious copy and pasting. We'll talk about how gameplay differs here in just a bit, but visually there's an incredible amount of asset variety. Everything you see feels handcrafted and placed with care, which is quite rare for a game of this scope, while definitely adding to the immersion. I found the surroundings to be so interesting I often walked instead of ran to my destination, or even just aimlessly wandered to take in the details of Hogwarts Castle. Early on I turned off the minimap, which forced me to explore the castle more intimately. The on-screen UI is helpful and well placed, but I would have really appreciated the option to have certain elements be dynamic instead of just on or off. There are a lot of beautiful sights to take in almost everywhere you look, whether you're walking up the grand staircase, looking around the Great Hall, checking out Hogsmeade, or staring at the castle from a far off distance. I definitely found the visual art direction to do an amazing job of creating atmosphere. Hogwarts Legacy is visually beautiful, but not flawless. Performance-wise, I had a rather smooth 60 FPS most of the time, with some hiccups here and there on PS5. I don't have any footage to show you, but having watched and played on Series S as well, I can't help but point out how poorly optimized this title is there. On PS5, I had a lot of weird visual bugs, usually related to lighting. Nothing game-breaking, but I did run into a few issues where I had to reboot. Series S had all the above and more. Load times are surprisingly longer, visuals look muddier, often sub 1080p, and frame rate is far less stable. I'm worried to see how this title will fare on weaker platforms in the coming months, considering how poor performance is on substantially more powerful hardware today. At this moment the game is playable, but I think these performance issues should not be ignored, even with the hopes of future patches ironing things out. Similar to the visual design language, the music and sound effects are top-notch. Right away you will notice several jingles and scores that harken back to many of John Williams' original works from the films. This soundtrack mixes well with the original scores of the movies, blending feelings of wonder and excitement with mystery and mischievousness. It's unfortunate that performance can be subpar at times considering how great both visual and audio presentation can be. Hogwarts Legacy appears to attempt to tell its own unique story that also feels like a callback to the books. There are plenty of nostalgic fan service moments, from being sorted into your house, to choosing your wand, and taking flight for the first time. The plot here feels appropriate to the wizarding world with its mystery setup and interesting characters. In typical Harry Potter fashion, the main story explores how certain events of the past relate to the main conflict of today. But there was never any sort of red herring or aha moment as the viewer. You learn of unusual relationships between characters, but all of which were fairly unsurprising. I was mostly entertained by the predictable story, with just enough setup to keep me interested in what was around the corner. Gameplay-wise, the idea of trials can be interesting, but as far as good storytelling, not as much. The four seekers put you through all seemingly unnecessary tests to prove your abilities, when it seems the more important question would be your character's morality. You're a 5th-year student whose body count rivals that of Voldemort, both discreetly and more obviously. You don't even have to unlock any unforgivable curses. I'm pretty sure turning someone into a chicken or striking them with lightning would be frowned upon by the Ministry. I mean, don't get me wrong, smashing bad guys into the ground repetitively like they owed you lunch money is a great time, but I couldn't help but notice the very video gamey nature of your overpowered psychopathic protagonist. Ranrock and Rookwood are pretty generic evil bad guys. They were both rather boring, and so I'm glad neither of them were on screen for very long. I found much of the main cast to be a little underdeveloped, while many of the secondary characters were surprisingly charming. My personal favorites were Poppy, Amit, Ominous, and Deke. The writers seemed to struggle to come up with a deep cast of characters, but the variety of different personalities kept many of the interactions feeling fresh. I also found several of the professors to be rather interesting, but felt I was never given as much time as I would have liked to get to know them. Many of my favorite moments were the lighter ones, like impersonating Professor Black, sneaking through the halls at night, and helping fellow students just get up to mischief. For me, I would have enjoyed more time dedicated to being in class, as well as participating in school activities and competitions, but your preference may vary here. Outside of the Golden Path, there are favors and side quest lines. Favors typically boil down to go to here and kill X, or collect X amount of Y, while the side stories have multiple missions attached to them with an overarching story. These relationship-centric side quests were some of my favorites, managing to stand out on their own, while often tying directly into the events of the main story. From a narrative and replay perspective, I would have liked more consequences to the player's actions, whether it's making the missions for each house be more divergent or having a direct impact on certain characters' fates. I think there could have been something worth exploring here, at least something worth keeping in mind for future titles. As a whole, Hogwarts Legacy's story is serviceable, while many of the characters were enjoyable. Hogwarts is fantastic with its unique look and feel that does an amazing job of capturing the spirit of the books and movies. I'm not sure how the entire world of Hogwarts stacks up against some of the all-time greats, but Hogwarts Castle is easily one of the best in-game locations I've ever visited. The school does an exemplary job of using small but impactful details to really make the place feel alive. Hogwarts truly feels like it has a real history to it, while also feeling independent to the player's actions. A lot of this perceived history comes from the frequent discoveries you make. When exploring throughout the castle, you'll constantly be asking yourself, I wonder what would happen if, and a lot of times something does happen. Over 45 hours later, I'm still stumbling upon hidden rooms and secrets that remind me just how much I like existing in this virtual world. Adding to this world's lively atmosphere is seasons. Inside, you'll see decorations change from pumpkins to Christmas trees, while the exterior world can almost look foreign when transitioning from one season to the next. To be honest, I wish there were more options to stop and soak in the moment, like sitting down at one of the tables of the Great Hall, or reading a book in the library. The world surrounding Hogwarts Castle is actually fairly large, as well as a little oddly shaped. Visually, there's a lot of cool things to find and see, but I was left a little disappointed by the comparatively light content here. With such a strong focus on Hogwarts Castle and the areas immediately surrounding it, they took all this time to add all this extra space, but just copy and pasted it with enemy camps, Merlin trials, wildlife, and plants that can already be found in the top half of the map. There's basically no reason to visit this half of the map if you aren't a completionist outside of a handful of missions, and maybe to grind out some Merlin puzzles. This didn't hurt my enjoyment of the game, but it just felt like missed potential. This isn't to say there weren't interesting places to visit outside of the castle, with both the Forbidden Forest and Hogsmeade having a lot of cool things to check out. Another highlight to Hogwarts Legacy's experience is mounts. Flying around on a broom gives you a three-dimensional sense of freedom as if you were a bird. You feel like anything you can see is a place where you can go, even though invisible borders were annoyingly easy to find at times. Not just leaving it there though, you do eventually unlock a real bird, or at least half of a real bird. Or it kind of looks to me more like 70%, but either way, you have a hippogriff. Riding a hippogriff across the lake and into the sky never got boring to me. Much like the feeling of being on a plane, there's a certain amount of excitement to take off, especially when the music starts to come on to cue at just the perfect time. Later on, you also get access to a grap horn, which I honestly almost never use due to being ground limited, but the way you get it is pretty cool. The only notable improvements to mounts would be getting a reaction out of fellow students as you roll into class on a Hippogriff. Being a game about wizard and witches casting spells with sticks leaves a lot of room for things to go wrong. I'm happy to report the implementation of magic and spells in Hogwarts Legacy is fantastic across its multiple elements of gameplay. Combat is surprisingly engaging and athletic. A good defense is the best form of offense here. You have to be quick to respond to incoming attacks while also being aware of the battlefield. Many enemies have colored shields that require a certain type of attack, and so a diverse spell set is highly encouraged. And so if you're just wanting to go in with the boom boom bang bang kind of spells, you may find combat to be a bit challenging. The vast majority of spells you learn can be utilized here, allowing for your own flow and style to combat. Unlocking and equipping up to 4 sets was a nice option to have a specific combo of spells against certain types of matchups. For example, I would often mix and match spells that implemented fire and pushing enemies away when dealing with spiders, while instead opting for more of a disarming approach when encountering dark wizards. There's a solid selection of different types of enemies, but for how much combat is implemented, I would have personally liked to see even more variety. As much fun as combat can be, I also had a lot of fun with my assortment of spells and how they interact with the world around me. Sometimes you'll utilize specific spells for a straightforward puzzle, while other times you're just figuring stuff out, which I often found to be the most rewarding. In the surrounding areas and within Hogwarts, there's a good mixture of different types of physical and mental puzzles. You'll find a lot of Merlin trials that often have a simple solution, you just have to figure out the how. No one activity stood out to me as amazing, but this is where variety shines in keeping things interesting. Usually completing puzzles and just most tasks in general, you're rewarded with gear to customize your character with. Now this takes me to perhaps my biggest issue with Hogwarts Legacy, and that's this game's implementation of gear and its relationship to your inventory slots, or lack thereof should I say. Outside of spells, the primary reward you get for almost anything in this game is gear. And considering how small your starting inventory is, you run out of space very quickly. You can expand your gear slots after completing a certain amount of the aforementioned Merlin trials, which in theory sounds fine, but in execution is an annoying grindathon. The Merlin puzzles are not bad. In fact, I enjoyed several of them, but after 10 or so, you've kind of been there, done that. Having a lot of these is not inherently bad, especially to those of you who just want to exist in this world, but where I have issue is how many of these trials you have to complete just to have a slightly larger but still inadequate amount of space to carry around all the gear you find. You'll often have to choose between stopping by a shop to sell stuff after and before each adventure or mission, or just throwing away the potential income by destroying it just to make space. Again, this gameplay loop is not bad in concept, but it's ratioed terribly in my opinion. Even just the option to preview what new gear you find would at least help inform the player. Fortunately, there are several other types of collectibles throughout the game that are far less crippling to progression. Personally, I believe I would have been more interested in the implementation of stats on certain items such as your wands and mounts. Altogether, the overall gameplay loop of Hogwarts Legacy is a blast, gear aside. Going from duels to environmental puzzles with a constant drive to unlock new spells and areas to explore, there's a lot for players to like here. Hogwarts Legacy is a very ambitious title that looks to perfectly capture the essence of the wizarding world while also just being a great game. And with some hiccups along the way, Hogwarts Legacy mostly delivers in both of these regards. 8.5. I do believe if you're an existing fan of the franchise, especially one that grew up with the movies, you will especially love this game. Now, if you've never gotten into the wizarding world and just don't care, then I still think there's a solid open world RPG to be had, perhaps with just a little bit of magic being lost. With those recommendations in mind, I would actually highly recommend canceling your pre-order if you have one on PS4, Xbox One, or Switch. At least until you've seen a channel like Digital Foundry give their take on those versions. Have you played or are you in the middle of playing Hogwarts Legacy? If so, let me know what you think in the comments below. If you liked the video, make sure you leave a like and feel free to check out some of my other content as well. As always, I appreciate you for watching, and until next time, see ya!